All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is the webinar about the cost evaluation survey process for the SMART program assessment. All right, let's jump into it. So, real quick, I'll start this out with some introductions to myself and the project, but more importantly, go over the objectives of what this webinar is about, the topics that we'll cover, and kind of some final steps. Along the way, I hope to kind of walk you through each step of the SMART program assessment process from my end of things, BW Research. I'll start by talking through the development of our survey instrument, the process that we went through to build and test it. Next, I'll talk a bit about what's new to the survey this year for folks who took it last year. Then I'll cover our kind of modeling process and how we convert the survey inputs that we receive from all of you into the outputs that we pass on to the DOER team. And then finally, I'll go over kind of just an overview of our process and our outputs and how we use all of this information. And then I'm going to close out this webinar by talking about the process for the question and answer portion of this webinar. So after you're done watching this webinar, you should be able to submit questions through a link that's posted somewhere nearby. But I'll have a little bit more instructions about that at the end. Okay, so let's jump right in. Really quick, I'll do a quick introduction for myself. I'm Nate Hunt. I'm a research director at BW Research. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means in a minute, but thought it would be good to introduce myself at the start. Okay, so there are four main objectives for this webinar. First is just to provide an overview of what the SMART program assessment is, from start to finish, what it entails, and what the different steps are. As I mentioned before, I want to introduce you to the survey instrument if you haven't already taken it last year. And if you have already taken it, just better familiarize everybody with the types of data that we're collecting, how that data is utilized, how it's not utilized, things like that. I also, will be walking through what we do with the data, what different assumptions we have, and how the model that we develop is utilized to create outputs and what those outputs mean. And then also, I, really want to emphasize how this data is being collected, how it's being used, how we are kind of handling any data that you provide to us, and then also how the outputs are being handled and utilized. So I'll go into each of those as we carry on. So as I mentioned before, I'm a research director at BW Research. I'm serving as the project manager for this project. Phil Jordan, the CEO, is serving as the principal investigator. BW Research is really an expert firm at data collection, survey research, rigorous, reliable data collection, as well as program evaluation, cost benefit analysis, economic models that really translate some of the information that we collect into ultimately kind of findings and recommendations around policy. But it's not just the BW Research team on this project. We're also supported by a few experts from the National Lab of the Rockies, formerly known as the National Renewable Energy Lab. There's three folks here that are listed, but as we need, we're able to kind of tap a few other experts on the solar and storage team. But between these three, there's policy experts, there's experts on developing NRELs or NLRs database of the annual technology baseline data, which is a really reliable data source that also has a pretty substantial data collection effort. And then also, we have experts on the system advisory model. I'll call it SAM throughout the rest of the presentation. But that's an open source model developed by NLR and I believe Sandia National Lab in collaboration. but Matthew Perlman is one of the developers of the SAM model, and so he's been helping us make sure that our models are running as efficiently and effectively and accurately as they can. So really quickly, I just kind of want to give you an overview of the 2027 program year assessment. We are already in June. It's flying by. We are currently in the educational webinar, this purple box here. And the survey is actually going to be out in the field, sent to a lot of you listening soon, later in July. More on that later. And the survey will be out in the field for about a month, hopefully, maybe a little bit longer if we need to. And then we have a period of data cleaning and aggregation, just making sure that responses are valid, and also tabulated into a usable form for to serve as an input into the SAM, open source modeling. I keep mentioning open source because it's important to us. It's important to DOER, that our process is transparent, that it's replicable, and by using an open source modeling tool, not only it's one of the most reputable and kind of publicly tested modeling services out there, but it also means that anybody can kind of poke around, check out the assumptions that are included in there, the inputs, things like that. So anyway, back to timeline. We'll generate findings sometime, closer towards the end of August, where we will then kind of share preliminary findings with a kind of smaller group of folks at DOER and the Attorney General's office, and potentially some folks at the utilities. After some kind of, internal evaluations, there's going to be a draft report that's published on October 1st that will have kind of the proposed incentive rates under the SMART program, and that will kick off a months-long public comment period, October through November, which again opens kind of the opportunity for more deliberations, more questions about the process and any outputs that were developed. And then the final report will be published on December 1st of this year. So something's happening almost every month. So keep an eye out there. Starting from the top of our process, the survey instrument is really the core to this research project for us, and kind of has a dual mandate, in that we wanted the survey to be as kind of thorough as possible, collect a rich amount of data, and certainly all the data that's necessary as a cost input. But the other side of that dual mandate is kind of the opposite, where if we make the survey too long, then nobody's going to respond to it, which we definitely don't want. So balancing those two worlds is really what we spent a lot of intentional time around. In order to keep the survey accessible, we really tried to optimize for asking the data points that were most relevant to as an input into the SAM model, but then also the data that's most readily accessible to the developers, installers, project owners, and so that they can provide kind of the most amount of data possible without putting too much of a burden on survey respondents. And so we developed the survey through a series of interviews with these folks, just to get a sense of what data they had readily accessible, in what format, what metrics, and then mapping that in how it relates into the inputs that SAM utilizes, and also the primary drivers of generating those SAM outputs. So connecting those kind of two inputs and input requirements was where we spent a lot of time and attention. Ultimately, we're really only asking for the most relevant data. Um, we want to know about projects that are, really only eligible for the 2027 program year. And the data that we're collecting falls into three primary buckets. First would be installed costs or CapEx, um, anything that's kind of that, uh, you know, lump sum upfront dollar amount that goes into getting the project built. Um, the second bucket there is fixed costs or anything around, annual costs, O&M, land lease, anything that's kind of on an annual recurring basis. And then the third bucket is a range of financial parameters. So for each project, we're hoping that respondents can provide information around what the debt equity ratio is, what the interest rate on that debt is, um, what the internal rates of return are for the equity side of the capital stack. Some of the really basic, again, financial parameters that do seriously drive the 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 models and the outputs that we need. One thing that I definitely want to relay in this webinar is that the data that you provide to all of us stays entirely confidential. Nobody outside of the BW research team directly, responsible for this project will ever see any of these raw responses. And actually, once the survey is closed, we assign every respondent and a unique identification number, and then remove all of that personally identifying information. So from that point on, all data is pretty anonymized unless we have an explicit reason to go back and check who that specific respondent was. But nobody at DOER, nobody at the National Lab of the Rockies, nobody outside of BW Research would have access to any of the information that you provide. And then also, we're very conscious and careful about how outputs are reported. So outputs are only reported in aggregate. If there's only one or two respondents for a certain project type, we will actually integrate secondary data where we can to both kind of bolster the reliability around that data, but also to sort of suppress that unique response so that somebody can't kind of reverse engineer some of the outputs for a specific project type. So for folks who took the survey last year, it should look largely similar this year, with three main exceptions. These exceptions were kind of developed through a series of interviews. Some of you who are maybe listening right now. But after the survey last year, we wanted to make sure that, the data points that we were collecting were, it was very clear what we were asking for, that we were asking for the full range of project costs that are relevant to the end result here. And so we kind of made these three main revisions to the survey this year. The first is, in addition to asking that kind of basic installed cost figure for each project type, we're also asking kind of a subset of questions around specific elements of that installed cost. So there's a specific call out for interconnection costs and a specific call out for development fees. These were two areas that were raised by stakeholders as areas that were particularly volatile and might not actually roll up into the installed cost estimate as neatly as some other elements do. And so breaking this out kind of serves a twofold benefit. One is that, it makes it a little bit more clear in the survey that in fact, we want that interconnection cost included in that installed cost value that we're asking. But two is that, having more granular information on maybe some specific pain points of projects allows us to do some internal side analysis of looking at, maybe comparing the reported interconnection costs that developers and installers are facing versus, maybe the national average of interconnection costs or something like that. And maybe there's some useful findings through that information that we can then relay to DOER that then, can lead to some other actions. Similarly, for the fixed kind of annual costs that we're looking to collect, we have a specific carve out for land lease costs. Again, that was an area that was identified by stakeholders as something that was a little bit more volatile, a little bit more project dependent, and could be particularly a driver of the ultimate cost of a project and the energy coming from that project. The second revision to the survey this year, now that we have some more, a little bit more certainty around the fate of the federal tax credit, although certainly not 100% certainty. We are asking a kind of specific series of follow-up questions about the project's expected eligibility for the PTC or the ITC, as well as the expectations around meeting FEOC requirements. Given that, meeting both of these thresholds will incur additional costs on projects, we wanted to, first call attention to the fact that that might be happening. But then also from a modeling perspective, we want to be able to kind of break those out so that we can see, do projects that have to meet a FEOC requirement have, a higher, ultimately a higher cost? How much higher is that cost? And what does that mean for setting the SMART incentive? And then finally, the third way that the survey is new this year or different this year, we are asking about the internal rate of return for the equity portion of that capital stack. So last year, we kind of, understanding that this is a rather sensitive data point, we kind of used some existing literature from financial institutions like Lazard and other firms to kind of get a better sense of what that anticipated internal rate of return would look like. But we heard from stakeholders this year that that's a really important component to include. And so we're explicitly asking for it this year, either for the actual numeric amount or an approximation is fine. We will find a way to kind of put some realistic thresholds around that. But either way, these kind of three different revisions to the survey give us more granularity, I think help add clarity around the things that we're asking, and also allow us to kind of turn the different dials of the model in unique ways that will help give us a little bit more insight into project costs. So for the survey itself, if you took the survey last year, then the sample bubbles to the right probably look a little familiar. The box to the bottom right of the screen is what hopefully most folks will see. If you're able to provide actual exact dollar amounts for projects, which is our preferred ask, our preferred source of information that we collect, then your survey will largely look like that screen on the bottom right. If you're only able to provide approximations around cost, which is still useful, but a little bit less useful, the data is a little bit noisier. And so, if people are able to provide firm numbers, that's ultimately, much more useful to us, certainly much more useful to DOER, and will result in ultimately a more accurate um, incentive amount. Um, so some basics about the survey design. We ask for the specific costs by project type and project size. Given that there's a lot of combinations across those categories, we ask that respondents produce up to five. If you want to go over that, you're more than welcome to. I don't think the survey will really max you out, but we realize that five is probably enough of an ask. Um, in the case of, when we are asking for, if people are only able to provide approximations, we provide anchor values from that NREL annual technology baseline data set. And then when, folks are able to, the preference is to provide, the exact dollar per kilowatt figures where possible. Um, in terms of who gets the survey, we send out the survey to both a known and unknown universe. The known universe would be firms that have previously, enrolled in SMART or have had communications with DOER. And the unknown universe is, typically developed through third-party data providers who can use industry codes to identify firms that are likely, involved in solar project development or installation. Um, and we have, quality screeners in place to ensure that only the types of respondents that would really know this information are actually filling out the survey. Last year, we had 51 unique respondents who actually provided about, on average, five project types each. So much appreciated for your willingness to spend some time and to provide some really granular data to us. Um, the process for developing kind of those installed costs and fixed costs on an annual basis, building those out for each project type and project size combination. Um, when we have a lot of responses for a particular project type, is quite easy. And the way that we do the weighting is that actually, the more survey responses that we get for a given project type, the more that those estimates will actually be driven by the survey responses themselves. Whereas if we only have one or two responses for a specific project type, those are instances where we'll actually more heavily utilize some of the secondary data that exists, um, primarily from the NLR ATB dataset, um, so that, as I mentioned earlier, we're not specifically just kind of citing only one project and taking that as applicable to all the other potential projects of that size or of that type. Um, but then that also, helps give our results a little bit more reliability outside of one or two, single respondents. Um, we also do some processing to really kind of mitigate outliers. We don't want somebody who's, button mashing or, elevating responses on certain numbers. We don't want that to drive, the average or something of our estimates. And so we typically what we use is median to find kind of the center middle project. Um, and then we also run some additional analyses around the 25th and 75th percentiles, so that um, we do kind of have a little bit more range, a little bit of a confidence interval around what the kind of end result is for projects that have, slightly lower costs or slightly higher costs than kind of the broader reported average. So again, we kind of most heavily lean on median when we're thinking about any recommendations to DOER. But those 25th and 75th percentiles are really useful in understanding um, kind of the range of industry costs. Okay, so um, talking a little bit about the modeling process itself. As I mentioned, we use SAM, which is the National Lab of the Rockies, open source tool. Um, it actually is able to model a number of different energy projects, but they have specific models for PV and for storage. And so that's what we utilize here. I already covered the input data, but again, it's the three categories. We're asking for the installed costs, the fixed annual costs, things like O&M, and then also those financial parameters, the interest rate, the debt equity ratio, things like that. SAM is really, really helpful in that it has a wide range of kind of customizability. Um, there are things like weather and capacity factors and electricity rates and escalators that you can customize. But SAM also has some really helpful defaults where, for instance, in this case, SAM has the average weather for, the prior years, um, and utilizes that to adjust capacity factors. And so we are truly modeling the anticipated weather and how that affects generation capabilities for solar projects in Massachusetts. Same thing with capacity factor and electricity rates. And this year we're hoping to incorporate some sensitivities around electricity rates and potential escalators and what that means. And ultimately, what this means is between the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile of the reported, costs that we get from all of you, as well as changes in assumptions around electricity costs or availability of tax credits or the stringency of FEOC requirements, which is kind of what a lot of our modeling was last year. We run a large number of scenarios in order to get kind of a sense of what different scenarios or inputs, different cost drivers, how that will affect project costs, um, and ultimately what that means for setting the incentive rate. So the chart on the right-hand side of the screen here is just an example of some of the outputs that we developed last year as part of our macroeconomic scenarios. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around FEOC requirements, but there was even more so back then. And so we ran some kind of basic macroeconomic scenarios of what happens if the price of an inverter goes up 30 or 40%, or what happens if the module price goes up 100%. These are useful scenarios to better, to have conversations with DOER, and so that DOER can better kind of make judgments and assessments around some of these bigger kind of policy implications that we're facing. So anyway, developing a range of estimates, running a range of scenarios really does give us kind of a richer set of data and allow DOER to kind of make some more informed decision making around incentives. Okay, really quickly switching to outputs. So SAM itself, the output of SAM, is levelized cost of energy, LCOE, which is slightly different than what DOER has asked the BW research team to develop as an estimate, which is levelized revenue requirement. Um, okay, so that that final figure, I can unpack that a little bit here. So levelized revenue requirement is basically LCOE, so the model, the values that we get out of SAM directly, um, plus the internal rate of return on the equity portion of the project. So this is why we ask all of those financial parameter questions, because it allows us to take that LCOE figure from that SAM model, adjust it kind of slightly based on returns to get that final metric that DOER is looking for. So let me unpack that formula a little bit more, right? So internal rate of return is the return on the equity portion of the project. LCOE is the levelized cost of energy, really that whole like um, bundled and averaged cost of the energy that's generated from the project. And when you combine those two things, you get the levelized revenue requirement, which is ultimately what DOER was looking for. The reason I believe why DOER was looking for levelized revenue requirement instead of LCOE is the fundamental idea that if a project makes exactly the amount of money that it costs, then you probably won't have too many solar and storage projects built around the state. Investors and especially equity investors usually require at least some return, right? Um, and so the incorporation of the internal rate of return is really important kind of factor here. Um, so I think I'll close out by again kind of reiterating that really one of the strong suits of this process is um, the depth of data that we collect. We collect, project specific data based on project size, project type, the involvement of if there's a battery in the system or not, um, some macroeconomic scenarios, so considerations of electricity rates in the future, or supply chain troubles, or in this case, some modeling around projects and their FEOC eligibility, um, and then also the range of input sensitivities that we get. Um, we run model iterations for each combination of those. Um, and so last year we had more than 6,100 different kind of model iterations, which helped us kind of get a better macro view of these are kind of the total range of possibilities of what we think these final like cost estimates could be. But this band is, the most likely or the most probabilistic is kind of the end result of our process there. Um, okay, so I think that's our final slide. Um, I hope that answered more of your questions that it created. However, this is a great opportunity, and this is actually the formal kind of kickoff. Um, the link that you used to watch this video somewhere nearby should be another link that allows you to actually submit questions. And a week from the day that this video is published, we'll have a live Q&A session where me and some of the other members of the project team will come back in and kind of give some live reactions to questions that folks have. Um, so with that, I'll leave off here. But we are looking forward to your questions. Really appreciate your time listening to me for the past half an hour or so. Um, if you're listening to this and you're an eligible survey participant, please keep an eye out for that survey link. Um, And yeah, we look forward to your questions, and thanks for listening.